The first artist we'll look at is Jennifer Daniel, who is an emoji designer for Google. This work gives us some great examples of proportion, scale, and readability, which are very important aspects of small-scale designs like emojis, icons, or logos. When we talk about proportion, we're talking about the size of an object in relationship to another object, or in relation to the whole composition. Notice the relative size here of the facial features of this very happy pineapple, as well as the top in relationship to the rest of the composition. If we're thinking of naturalistic facial features or realistic pineapple proportions, both parts of the image are quite large compared to the rest of the composition. And that's something that helps the most important parts of this image be easily recognized at small scale. This means it has good readability. Here's another example from the same artist showing a stylized graphic style. So here we're representing visual images according to a creative or an artistic pattern rather than according to nature or science or tradition. Our next artist is Angela Gusman, who is an emoji designer for Apple. This early version of the dress emoji is a great example of naturalism, which places an emphasis on scientific observation without idealization. So even though this design is a little bit simplified, it's actually based on a real-life dress, and a lot of the proportions and visual features have carried through to the final design. We can also look at her work for a great example of the difference between subject and content. So here we have the eggplant emoji, which she designed. And if we talk about the subject of this image, it's simply the thing being shown. So the subject here is eggplant. When we talk about the content, though, we're talking about the intellectual, psychological, spiritual, narrative, or aesthetic aspect of an artwork or design, or more simply, the meaning of the image. Now, if you're familiar at all with emoji culture, you might know that this emoji is often used as a phallic symbol since it does sort of resemble a phallus. So the subject is eggplant, the content is usually phallic symbol. Next up we have Susan Kerr, who was a very early designer for Apple and Facebook. And here we have an icon that was used in early versions of email interfaces. So this is a fantastic example of the relationship between space and readability. Notice the spacing between the diagonal lines that make up the shape of the front of the envelope. At larger scale, those look very spaced out, but you can see at smaller scale that spacing appears to collapse, and what it gives us is a lighter line that defines the front of the envelope shape without taking too much visual pull away from the love letter, which is clearly the focal point. This actually gets us to the second part of the space definition, which is the feeling or illusion of depth produced by an image. And this careful attention to space is what gives this image good readability at small scale. So it's easy to distinguish all of the visual elements that are most important. We can also look at a later example of her work for Facebook. So early on in Facebook's legacy, users were able to send one another gifs in the form of small images. So this is one example of a gift that you could give someone in an early version of Facebook. So again, we can talk about this relationship of space versus readability. Here, the spaces between each of the individual artwork elements are relatively small. At large scale, each shape looks distinct. But at smaller scale, that spacing appears to compress, so the overall disco ball shape looks more continuous at small scale than it does at large scale. So the takeaway is, when we scale an image down, space tends to compress, and that's something we'll often need to exaggerate one way or the other to preserve readability. Our next example comes from the artists Elsa and Tyler Lang, who are emoji designers for Microsoft. So this example of the grinning cat emoji is a great example of exaggeration, where we use visuals to make something look more intense than it actually is. Specifically here, I'm looking at the exaggeration of the facial features of this cat character. If we compare to an actual cat, I can see that the eyes of the emoji cat are almost twice as high as the actual cat. And the nose of the emoji cat is also about twice as wide as the actual cat. So these exaggerations are what help the emoji cat to be readable at small scale. Don't be afraid to use similar exaggerations in your own work for this assignment.